Hello and welcome, everyone. It's good to see you. I'm glad to have you joining with us. Feel free to say hello and welcome in the chat. If you'd like to say hello, and also feel free to participate with us in the chat as we go on today. We're going to be looking at Psalm 139 together, and which I think is a very commonly talked about psalm, and I think also as we've been talking about in terms of our community, like how it particularly affects the trans community and queer community more broadly. And so before we get started, why don't we start with some introductions? So hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Community Engagement here at TMC.
I'm Peter, pronouns they, them, and I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator at TMC.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellis. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the summer intern here at TMC.
Yeah, and if you'd like to, I see we've got Ultra Woman. I think that might be Isabel. Welcome in. Hi, Jamie. Feel free to say hello in the chat as you join in with join with us. So why don't we go ahead and get started? As just a little bit of a kind of our flow, what we generally do is we generally like to read it together, read the passage together, and then we split it up into sections. So we'll read it like section at a time and spend some time discussing. If you have any, feel free to read along with us. And if you have any comments or questions or things that you're noticing as you read, feel free to put them in the chat as we go. I think before we start, I think Ellis, you had some framing for us for the passage.
Yeah, thank you. So something I like to do when I'm reading the Bible or reading a particular piece of scripture from the Bible is to think about that scripture and its context, why it was written, who it might have been written by. So Psalm 139 is one of the last Psalms that we get in the book of Psalms. And like a lot of the Psalms, this one is usually attributed to King David. And yeah, I think something that I like to remember about the Psalms in particular that I feel like we don't really get as much in terms of vibes from the way we often read it is that while we have Psalms written down and we usually read them as something more like a poem, in their original context, they actually would have functioned more like a hymn. They would have been sung, they would have been accompanied by musical instruments, they would have had some kind of rhythm and rhyme scheme probably that's a little bit lost in layers of translation. So at the end of the day, Psalms were a way of people to worship God. The communities they were created in are usually asking God for something that they need, and they offer this good window of insight into how these communities viewed God, what kinds of images they had for God, and just what they were going through in their historical context at the time. And I think we'll see that play out a little bit in the psalm we're reading today. And as for Psalm 139 in particular, I think it paints an interesting picture of how complex God can be, because there's kind of a lot of different imagery used for God throughout this psalm. God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing in a way that can be kind of scary, which I think we'll get into in a little bit here, but God is also very nurturing and loving, and these two things aren't presented as contradictions. So yeah, that's just a little bit that I dug up on Psalm 139.
Thanks, Ellis. I think those are really great. Those are really great points. And just like also just thinking about the communal nature of Psalms, of the Psalms in general, I think it's something that we don't think about all the time in the way that we often read it rather than think about it being sung or chanted or in that way. I see there's a question about captions and being able, and I'm not sure if captions are available. If you can try the auto-generated captions on YouTube, I don't know if that's possible, but we can definitely look into it. So please, let us know if that works. And if not, then I'll try to look into it while we're going. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started with reading the first 6 verses, and I can kick us off here. We were talking about which versions we're using or we're reading. And so I'm going to be reading in the NLT. What about you all?
I've got the NRSV updated edition.
Yeah, I've also got the NRSV updated edition.
Right. So yeah, I normally go with the NRSV, but sometimes with the Psalms, it's nice to go with a more like a poetic translation or a more interpretive translation to see just kind of the language that gets used. Feel free to share what translation you're all kind of using or following along with in the chat if you're following along in your Bible. So I'll get us started with we're reading, this is verses 1-6. O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. First of all, I was like just noticing I'm used to reading something about you hem me in, the language of hemming or like kind of like closing. So just that was an interesting, you go before me and follow me, which I think is a more everyday way of understanding what hemming in means.
Yeah, it's interesting how the different ways this is translated can make it feel very different in terms of the relationship to God being expressed. Like, I think you were saying, Ellis, like there are ways in which this feels almost threatening sometimes if you read it a certain way, and then in other ways it can feel so comforting of like this intimacy with God or this closeness, you know, where like God is always present, you know, in all of these different circumstances of our life. And I noticed in the translation that you were using, Micah Melody, I kind of liked this one, like actually very small difference from that translation in the NRSV. I think it was, instead of the phrase from far away, it was even when I am far away. And that felt a little bit more evocative to me of like, when I feel far away from God, God is still with me. Like even when I am far away, even when I feel this distance, God's still close to me. I liked that, the use of that phrase in that translation.
Yeah, I think as much as I like the NRSV is what I usually use. It can be very academic, which is helpful if you're in seminary and writing a paper, but it can also be a little bit dry in a way that the more poetic translations aren't. So yeah, I love the translation you're using.
Well, what other things do you notice in this section? And yeah, for everyone kind of like watching along, what are some things that you've noticed or your kind of questions that you have or things that you're noticing in this particular section? What stands out to you? And same for you, Peter and Ellis. Is there anything that was particular? I know, Peter, you were talking about kind of the intimacy about it.
Yeah, I found this reflection from Nancy DeClacy Walford on the Working Preacher website, talking about how there's all this use of like the second person pronoun for God, like you, in like this beginning section of the psalm, and like how that kind of has this implication of intimacy. And then she quotes Walter Brueggemann: "The Psalms are prayers addressed to a known, named, identifiable you. This is the most stunning and decisive factor in the prayers of the Psalter." So just again, like addressing God in this personal way. And then also, she goes on to quote from a book called Tales of the Hasidim by Martin Buber, who wrote a poem kind of also reflecting on that same relationship that you get with that second person pronoun. Where I wander, you. Where I ponder, you. Only you, you again, always you. You. When I am gladdened, you. When I am saddened, you. Only you, you again, always you. You. Sky is you, earth is you, you above, you below. In every trend, at every end, only you, you again, always you. You. I thought that was just a really like meaningful reflection on this like relationship being expressed here in this psalm specifically.
That's really cool. I like the IU relationship that I mean, I see it in the Psalms, but it's not. I like how explicit that makes it, or like how much it points it out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting quoting kind of Walter Brueggemann. One of my favorite books is Psalms in the Life of Faith by Walter Brueggemann, and kind of really thinking about the way of the relational aspect of the Psalms, and that God is directly addressable. Particularly, I like really kind of think about the Psalms of Lament, where God makes God's self accessible to lament, but also to praise and to joy and to celebration. And I think, both are important in kind of this accessibility of God. Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think in general, something that really strikes me about the Psalms is how intimate they are and how close God feels, because I feel like in a lot of scripture passages that tend to be more narrative, third person instead of first person, that kind of thing, it feels like God is at a distance, kind of ruling from above. But here, God is so present in your life. God knows everything about you, that kind of thing. And yeah, the most famous image of this psalm, which we'll get into a little bit later, is that God has known us since we were conceived, has knit us together in the womb, that kind of thing, and just knows everything about us, basically. And I think this is an interesting passage to read through the lens of being trans or queer or gender expansive or wherever you fit under the umbrella, because it's so common, I think, when we're coming out, we're starting to figure ourselves out a little bit, to feel like we don't even know ourselves. I think, there's this image of your egg cracking and you're cast into this whole new life and you don't really know what you're doing a lot of the time, at least early on, or at least that's how I felt. And
Same.
yeah. But yeah, I think it's really comforting in a way to know that there is some kind of answer, there is some kind of plan beyond it, that even if we don't know who exactly we are just yet, even if we still feel like we're figuring it out in a really big way, God kind of has a plan behind it, and God knows where they're calling us, and we're just kind of figuring it out.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, it kind of fits with verse 4 too. Even before a word is on my tongue, oh Lord, you know it completely, is how my translation puts that. But like, I think that is really a comforting line to me, because sometimes it's very hard to put these truths about ourselves into words, but that doesn't make them less true. If it, and like during the, entire, whatever the period was of each of our lives before we were able to even put those words to our experience, like that, it was still true. It was still like kind of like held in the heart of God, in this really deep way. And that does feel really comforting.
I love, I'm just like, this is striking me now, but verse 4, even before a word is on my tongue, oh Lord, you know it completely, is also reminds me of kind of the God being, like God knowing our prayers even before we're able to even articulate. And that to me is a lot of hope. I mean, from a Christian perspective and Christian lens, it reminds me of the passage of about the Spirit, the Holy Spirit interceding for us, and it beyond words, right? So like the idea of, and I come from, my own tradition is a charismatic tradition where, praying in the Spirit, sometimes you don't have physical, literal words, and all you can do is mutter things that might sound like gibberish, and even to myself, but sometimes that is just like brings a lot of like peace and like sense of like God's presence, that God knows what I need, even sometimes deeper than I do. And sometimes that invitation, though, I think sometimes I've heard that kind of God knows you better than you know yourself as a way that gets weaponized against some people. of like,
Mm-hmm.
why don't you trust God to know that God made you this way, or God's doing this? And I think that part of that is it requires the humility on behalf of everyone to know, like, if God knows us better than we know ourselves, well, God certainly knows other people better than I think I know them or what's best for them. So like, I don't know if that makes sense, but
Mm-hmm.
I just think that sometimes that sentiment gets weaponized, especially against queer and trans people.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk about a little bit later, I'm sure the use of this psalm is both liberating, but also has been used historically to actually oppress the trans community. Are we ready to move on to the next section?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Peter, you want to take the next few verses?
Sure. I'll read verses 7 through 12. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and night wraps itself around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you.
Every time I hear this, I don't even know if I can even put it into words, but verse 12, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. It always strikes me, that imagery, and obviously imagery around light and darkness, there's mixed history on how that's been used, and I do want to name that. Like, light and dark have been used, unfortunately, in long histories of oppression against different people, especially Indigenous folks, and also in racist history. But also this kind of idea of like darkness or uncertainty, I think, as the context is being used in this, is as bright as the day. I think, to me, I just really gravitate toward the shining light into, or like making clear the uncertain. At least that's my own kind of sense of interpretation of what they're. I see Carolyn says, Coverdale says grave instead of Sheol in verse 8.
Yeah, there's definitely like, it's the poetic language is so powerful here, of like these contrasts, these like extremes that we can experience, and then like just talking about God's presence in all of them. I was reading that this psalm specifically is a bit hard to translate because it uses some unusual words. I don't know if either of you who like have a little bit more of a background in some of these, like, in Hebrew or like scripture studies, have heard anything about that, but like I was kind of curious if that some of the words are just a little tricky or not
pulling
used
up
elsewhere.
Logos right now.
Okay, great.
Where did you hear that specifically?
I was reading it in just like a couple of just like more detailed like exegesis papers that I was like skimming through. What were some of the words? Oh, yeah, Tom says, I take great comfort in verse 8, especially as a universalist. There's no separating yourself from God. To me, it gives me great peace. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Logos is not loading for me quite yet, so
we'll go back to that.
We
topic.
We will go back to it. I'm curious because yeah, it's always interesting to look at and this is one of those things where translation is always interpretation, and I think it is not talked about as much as I wish it was. That like translation, it always takes an element of trying to make an interpretive decision on what's the best word to use in a certain context. And so, yeah, totally. What other things are standing out in these verses?
I think really for this whole psalm, and then for each of these sections that we've already been reading, I think that I did notice when I was doing research about this psalm specifically, like how much of a like polar opposite interpretation different groups of people have for some of this, like what we were saying just a few minutes ago of like the ways that, you know, God knows you better than you know yourself has been weaponized against queer and trans people. And we'll talk about that a little later, I think, with the, the passage that Ellis was referencing. But I saw a bit of a reflection from Father Shea Kearns about it. And Father Shea said, like this whole, you know, when I sit down and when I stand up, and even if I tried to escape you, I couldn't. And I remember as a young queer kid feeling alienated from my church and my faith, feeling like I can't escape God even if I wanted to. So like, what's the point? How do I? And it felt very threatening to me. I think too, it's very easy for this passage to turn into an anti-trans passage of like, God knit you together in your mother's womb. So who are you to change who you are and to change your body? And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this passage can be read in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I was just noticing on that kind of context. Carolyn says, I don't know if anyone remembers the Sunday school song, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see." But these verses remind me of the omnipresent God surveilling constantly.
Mm-hmm. Surveilling is a good word. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like God's always looking over your shoulder.
Yeah. It's so interesting how that can be God knowing what's going. It can be a freeing thing in the sense of like, there is this like freedom or liberation in God knowing what's happening in the struggles that we're going through, and also can be weaponized in a sense of control. Carolyn, absolutely, that song, I hadn't thought of that song in years. It's interesting you bring that up, but I remember singing it in Sunday school and kind of going home when I was little, just like afraid, because that sense of like, be careful, little eyes, what you see, for the Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. That doesn't really sound super loving to me. So it is really interesting, the way that the context of how the passage is being used, or it could come in a sense of liberation and healing, or it can come in a sense of control and surveillance and fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in the same way, like Peter hinted at earlier, this can be a passage that is used to either liberate or oppress queer and trans people. I know, Peter, you were mentioning that when you were doing exegesis research work on this passage, about half the sources you were seeing were affirming and queer positive and all the good things, and then the other half were not so much. And I think that could be said for a lot of passages of the Bible. I know that you all did Genesis 1 for a recent Bible study too, I believe. And that's kind of similar, where there can be a very positive, gender expansive reading of it, or it can be completely binary and completely restrictive. Love the Father Shea quote, by the way. I feel like Father Shea is always popping up in my theological research doing cool things. But yeah, I spend a lot of time on social media, perhaps too much time. But one cool thing about social media is that you can find cool queer theologians doing good stuff. And I actually saw this Tumblr post the other day that described trans people as living into the gender they were called to be. And I think that's kind of the lens through which I'm seeing this passage. So it's not about biological destiny or anything like that. But I think it's kind of a recognition that God called us to be who we are as trans and gender expansive people before we even knew it ourselves. And yeah, by living into ourselves as we are in this way, we're kind of being who God called us to be, even in the womb, before we even knew it yet.
Yeah, who God like deeply knows us to be. Yeah, that kind of sense.
Yeah. I see Tom in the chat has said the NET has really in-depth notes for anyone who likes to look at the underlying language and translation choices. Thanks for the recommendation. I think, definitely it's also interesting to look at multiple different translations side by side to kind of pull out the kind of the nuances or the differences, and they see what gets translated differently. Tom also says, even in the Psalm, there is that double sense of loving intimacy, but also God's heavy, in parentheses, burdensome hand upon you. I think that kind of that sort of both and of kind of this. I think it's important to hold the both and, because as you read in Peter from the Father Shea quote, it's important to recognize that this passage can be translated or like can be interpreted by people in different ways, depending on the intent of how you're using it. And so, as we kind of like go through, before we kind of move on to the next section, I'd love to like, how do we go about holding that tension? Is something that how do you hold it for yourself? And like, how do you do that? Or like, how do you read this passage, recognizing that tension?
I think for me, it's possible to hold the tension well with some and not others. I think, even if I can recognize, like for some, I think we've had these conversations before at other Bible study lives. I think it sometimes depends a little bit on how a certain passage was originally presented to you, or how, like, whether it, like, in your sort of formative experience, it was used in harmful ways. Like there are some passages where, that a lot of queer people are able to find meaning in that, I haven't been able to, just because of the history that I have with how it's been used. And then others where that's not the case, And I think, like, to me, it feels important to know that we don't have to reclaim everything for ourselves. We can like recognize its value for others without needing to like kind of force the issue. It's like, if this reads to you just as, a sort of threatening, God who, is surveilling or looking over your shoulder, then maybe it's not, a passage for you to return to. But then if you're able to sort of, read it in this other way, then it might be of value.
Yeah, I like that. How about you, Ellis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've actually been digging into this question a little bit in a Bible study that I'm teaching for my church. It's a very LGBTQ themed Bible study, and something we do hold is that tension that passages can be interpreted very differently. And yeah, something that we were kind of getting into this week is that, the Bible's not infallible. It was written by people with certain views, that kind of thing. And people doing translations too have their own agendas. But yeah, something we also got into was the power of interpretation. So essentially, each individual person is going to read the Bible and come away with something totally different that is speaking to them on their journey. So I think, different interpretations are okay. Not everyone needs to hear the same thing or get the same thing from a piece of text.
Yeah, I like the recognition that it's okay that people can arrive at different places. I think that ultimately it's something that took me a really long time to learn, coming out of a very fundamentalist tradition where there was one right way to interpret scripture. And so I think that gives the permission to what you were saying, Peter, give some texts to find places of reclamation and liberation in some texts, and also to recognize that might not be the case for every single thing for every person, and that's okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and go to the next set of verses? Ellis, would you like to read those for us?
Yeah, before I do, it looks like we have a comment from Carolyn that just came in. Carolyn says, I'm trying to imagine what it would look like for these descriptions of God's relations to be mutual. Like, if this is what God does, what should I do in response?
Oh, that's a really interesting question.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm going to be sitting with that one for a while.
Yeah.
It's like one of those that you just kind of, that's an interesting perspective. Yeah. Also, I saw, also noticed that JFT had a comment that I have a translation that is knit together as defended together in the womb. And I like that better. That's really interesting. What translation is that? I'd be really curious to know what translation that is, to like even read some of the broader context of the translation. But I think that's a really good point of transition of moving us into that section that's like specifically talking about that. So Ellis, would you read those verses for us?
Yeah, totally. So here's verses 13 through 18. I'll be using the NRSV. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God! How vast is the sum of them! I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is kind of the meaty part for, I think, for a lot of trans folks, trans and gender expansive people, and queer folks more broadly too. That I'm sure a lot of us have probably heard in both affirming and non-affirming contexts. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you. Yeah. What comes up for you all in these verses 13 through 18?
Yeah, I feel like this is the part that, if you've heard any part of this psalm, you've probably heard those verses. Fearfully and wonderfully made, knit together in my mother's womb. And definitely, like in terms of what I was saying about the very polar opposite ways in which this passage is used, this is the part that a lot of people are focusing in on, because it is very specifically weaponized against trans people of like, this is, God made you in a certain way, and that entails this kind of, response to that from you. But then also, like, I saw so many queer and trans people reflecting on these passages as being really liberating and being really helpful in their recognition of, their trans identities and their like coming to know their authentic self and knowing that like that's who God made them to be.
Yeah. I was saying before, before we started and went live, this passage, this particular one, is often the one that I have quoted at me the most, and have experienced quoted at me by non-affirming like Christians who think that they are trying to convince me that like I'm going against God's will because I'm changing my body against the will of God. But when I read this, I actually have, I was raised in a more conservative tradition, and so it's been a process of reclamation. But when I read this, I think God did know me before I was born, but knew me as my full self, as God's daughter, in the fullness of who I am. And I find that an incredibly liberating and joyful thing. And for me, kind of the process of stepping into my identity is a process of stepping into what I sense is God's calling on my life. And so for me, this is like very much in alignment. But yeah, it absolutely has been kind of used against trans people a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, I just find the psalm and the set of verses in particular just so comforting. I think something that I experienced, that I know a lot of trans people experience, when I was transitioning and I first started to, notice changes from hormones, that kind of thing, I would look in the mirror and I would be like, oh, I recognize myself, and I've never recognized myself before. So it just feels so natural. It feels like I'm, living into who God called me to be, whereas I wasn't before. And I feel like that, Yeah, like you were saying, Micah Melody, earlier, it's kind of hard to put certain things into words, but it feels like the Holy Spirit is moving through you and speaking to you in times like that.
Absolutely. I love that. Looks like we've got a lot of conversation going on in the chat. Carolyn says the Coverdale in verse 15 says body instead of frame. And then in 16 says limbs. And I really like that embodied understanding. The CEV says embryo in 16, which feels jarring. Yeah, that's a very jarring. But I mean, like, totally. Like, I mean, I could see that from a kind of a scientific perspective, but I wonder what the kind of cultural understanding of that would if that's like reading kind of anachronistic culturally.
Yeah, I was reading that like that translation is considered to be, you know, a pretty specific interpretive translation and not really accurate to what the like sense of the word really is.
Yeah. JFD says, I have a love-hate relationship with this passage. Wonderfully made equals trans, but also feel like it minimizes the struggle as well. Yeah, also wonderfully made maybe could also mean being in general is amazing, and that's how amazing God is. Oh, I like that. Of like the process of being or just being able to is wonderful. Yeah. I appreciate you kind of bringing up the way that it minimizes the struggle, and I've actually heard that from some. I've heard that from some trans folks who feel erased by this passage when it's being used in a kind of a way of reclaiming, and it's something I think I've tried to be aware of, is that, you know, for some people that kind of idea that God made trans folks as trans feels unjust to some trans folks because of the kind of struggle it takes to be ourselves in a cis-normative society. And I can understand that and the tension there. And then Carolyn says, I like how the Coverdale doesn't have that notion of conception and how the womb is a place to grow. And I imagine the womb described in the verse extending to life as we continue to grow and change. Wow. I like that. Like it's a continual thing. And it reminds me of what we were talking about in the Genesis in the last month, as the idea of the process of ongoing creation, and that we are part of this ongoing making of ourselves. And then Carolyn also says, like in the Coverdale translation, it feels less like we are made in the womb and more like we are being continually made and changing.
Yeah, like the womb is a more kind of like symbolic concept of like a place in which we can grow and develop into ourselves.
Yeah. It's interesting, all the different translation possibilities here. I know, I think both of you had some like thoughts or notes on like kind of the kind of the possibility of different translations in this section.
Oh yeah, I had found this reflection from Aaron Green, who had translated a couple of these verses as, "For you created my most secret depths, you embroidered me in the womb of my mother. I praise you because I am fearfully made distinct. Your works are distinct, and my soul is well aware." And Aaron Green had talked about how distinct is a possible translation based on a lot of Hebrew scholarship that I didn't fully understand, but but I like that as a possible, you know, that again, that shift in translation puts just a slightly different slant on our understanding of what that could mean. But being like different or unusual or distinct or kind of, you know, is also like, I think a sort of freeing read of this section as well.
What about you, Ellis? I know you had, I think I saw you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how many different translations of the Bible we get, and how there can be these like very, very different English versions of the same Hebrew word, basically. And I think, something that was jumping out to me is that, you know, like the classic version of this passage is, "You knit me together in my mother's womb." But one of the translations that you brought up, Peter, was, "For you created my most secret depths, you embroidered me in the womb of my mother." And for some reason, the word embroidered really jumped out to me and kind of felt evocative in a way that I've never really seen this passage before. And I think, for one thing, there's kind of an interesting gender aspect there if you're picturing God doing embroidery, because it's a traditionally feminine thing. So I feel like in this image of God, I kind of see a woman, sitting at her sewing table, sewing something together, making something beautiful. And that's not a way that we would traditionally view God, but that's a way that clearly the people who wrote the psalm would view God as. So I think that's really interesting. And also just the image of embroidery, I think, in a way that some translations don't really cover. Embroidery just calls to mind so much attentiveness and dedication and just attention to detail. And God, as they created us, God cared about us like you'd care about a beautiful work of art or some craft that you're doing. And God cared about making us beautiful and intricate and detailed and all of that. And yeah, I think if God is creating us like a work of art or some beautiful craft, then we're just so beloved in such a beautiful and affirming way.
I love that. Embroidered. It is very evocative, and a very. I appreciate you bringing up kind of the gendered concept, because even knitting, I think like you knit me together. I think even knitting gets gendered, but for whatever reason, that particular phrase, I think, is so, at least in my head, it just is so commonly said because this passage is so common that that particular gendering of knitting, even in communities where knitting would be potentially gendered as feminine, doesn't for some reason for God. It's just an interesting, embroidered really does bring out some of those connotations of the social aspect of God subverting even expectations around what we might expect for, or how we might imagine God, in a traditionally like masculine sense.
Yeah, and embroidery too as an art form that's like about like just making things beautiful. Like it doesn't, I feel like with, even with knitting, often you think of like something more functional, like a scarf to keep you warm or something, which is, a great image too. But embroidery being like something that's just to take delight in its beauty, is also a kind of, like you were saying, Alice, an evocative way to think about God making us, and like delighting in us.
Yeah. I see Carolyn said in 18, with the mention of sand, I'm imagining how God's thoughts or plans are countless, and how it reminds me of the promise made to Abraham for his descendants to be as countless as the sand. That's a definitely a strong poetic parallel. And like I kind of wonder if the word thoughts or plans in 17 is almost a metaphor for humans. Yeah. I like that idea of humans being a thought and God's, like a human being a thought. It's there's a whole rabbit hole there of God's kind of thoughts being kind of the source of creation. And I like that kind of idea of like we are sustained by God in that way, or the divine in some way. But I think that's a really, that could be even metaphorical in the sense of like human, like the wonder of humanity. Any other thoughts or kind of observations on or questions about this section? All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and move to the last section? And I know we were initially kind of debating whether or not to kind of include this section, but I think it's worth kind of recognizing the complexity, as we were already talking about earlier, about holding the positive and the negative, the good and the difficult parts of passages. So I can read this for us. This is the 19 through the end. One moment, I lost my page. Actually, would someone else read it for us? I accidentally closed out of my my translation.
Yeah, I can read it.
Thank you.
Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting.
So what are some of your thoughts on this section?
Yikes.
Fair. Yeah. I hear that.
It really does. I mean, it seems, and I imagine that there might be some cultural context involved in how jarring of a turn it feels like to us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, it just feels like, where did this even come from? We're having this, like, this beautiful reflection on, God's, creating and knowing us. And then suddenly there's all this talk about hating and killing people. So yeah, it feels a little jarring.
It's quite the turn.
Yeah.
Like it's very celebratory and praise. And even though, I mean, but even I think also too, this kind of goes back to what I think Carolyn brought up earlier, or we've been kind of touching on it in a lot of different places of be careful little eyes, what you see, be careful little hands, what you do. Like even this, like verse 24, see if there's any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. Right. So there is this God's observation or God's kind of presence is also leading us in a way away from wickedness, which I can understand in the kind of like this, like a helpful leading, but also it's quite a turn in a very, very evocative way. And so, yeah, I don't know how to hold this fully myself with the rest of the passage. It does feel very, very disjointed to me, at least where I'm at culturally and within my own social location.
Yeah, I've preached on a couple of Psalms over the past year, and this is kind of a common theme in a lot of the Psalms where they're kind of, they're beautiful, they're evocative, and then they get kind of violent and kind of political toward the end. And yeah, I think, again, that's where the context of this being written in a particular community kind of comes in. This would be written, by the Israelites who see themselves as God's chosen people, and they were in danger from their enemies in a big way. And yeah, I think it kind of makes sense for a group that's maybe feeling oppressed or maybe feeling in danger to want a God who's going to protect them. And that is kind of a common theme we see across the Old Testament is God jumping in to protect people in sometimes scary and violent ways. But yeah, this psalm in particular, it does feel like such a sudden turn. It is very jarring, I would agree.
Tom says, it probably makes more sense when you live in a time or place where warfare is real and present in your life, like when family members have been slain. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine like that, like seeking justice or wanting some sort of kind of sense of closure to having lost like real, like a very tangible loss and grief in the community. I know some of the Psalms, I am not sure about this one in particular, Ellis, if you may know, but some of the Psalms are written, like speculated to be written during or the exile. And so, thinking about the Babylonian exile of the context of some of those, like, especially the lament Psalms where there's like immense grief and you can feel essentially the communal grief of being removed from your homeland. And then all of a sudden, maybe even coming back to your homeland and seeing the destruction. So like, I think, recognizing that context and recognizing that that's still happening around the world in many different in different places, and so I think it's a very real thing, but at least for me, my social location isn't quite there to fully grasp it to the same degree as it's in the passage.
Yeah, I took a class a couple semesters ago called Grief, Lament, and Human Suffering in the Hebrew Bible, and we touched on the lament psalms a lot. And I think one of my big takeaways from that class was just how beautiful lament is in a way. It allows for so much messiness. It allows for so much honesty with God, for us to not hold back if we're feeling angry or upset or frightened in a way that can be kind of, visceral and jarring to modern readers who are in a safer social location than these people were. But I think it really puts you in the mindset of these people who were in danger and living in such violent times back then.
Yeah. Carolyn says, I think it's interesting how the author portrays themselves as knowing God's will and enemies and aligning themselves. Like, while I like to think that I can recognize injustice, I'm not that confident. Yeah, that's true. I find it somewhat comforting that no specific group of people is named here. Like, maybe God's enemies are dynamic and not some static entity to be destroyed, but a larger movement of injustice. Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think it's so easy to read ourselves into this particular explicit position and then use this to weaponize it, which I think this psalm often has been weaponized and used in that way. And so I think, recognizing it takes a lot of cultural humility to recognize that while we want to believe that we can recognize injustice, recognizing that injustice is named by the people experiencing it. And so, I totally hear that. And thanks for raising that. Well, any last thoughts on this, as we move to close on this particular section?
I think the idea of asking God to test you is always a complicated one for me. That one gets a little rough, because I think it's expressed in a really compelling way here, in a way that I feel like I have felt sometimes, of no, I want to prove it. I want to prove that I'm faithful. I want to prove that I'm doing everything right, And so if we don't necessarily think of this section as a model of how we want to be, but just a sort of expression of how we sometimes feel, of this sort of need to know that, God approves of me, or God, that I'm on God's side, and to maybe then be able to interrogate that a little bit, and say, okay, well, is that really the sort of posture or relationship that I want to have to God and God's will?
Yeah, that tags in, I think, what Carolyn's bringing up of recognizing that it's easy to believe that we're on the side of God, but asking and interrogating and asking for ourselves, what is that? Where is the injustice happening, and kind of pushing for interrogating that for ourselves and recognizing where we might be complicit. So
or
it's tricky. Or not know. Really, that's a very big thing. Is we may not know fully. Well, thank you all for your thoughts, and for everyone in the chat. And as we close, any closing thoughts on this whole the passage as a whole, this psalm as a whole. What are your takeaways, Peter or Ellis?
Yeah, good question. I think what I'm walking away with is holding the complexity of the Psalms and the whole Bible in general. I think there's these passages that are so familiar, but so I feel like I know them so well that each time I go into it and read them again, I learn something new, and I can kind of walk away with something different. Because even when I helped pick this passage out for the Bible study, I had kind of remembered the beautiful, pretty part and just forgotten about those last 3 to 5 verses or so. So it was kind of interesting to read the whole psalm and think about the full context in that way.
How about you, Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sticking with me is definitely the sort of reading Ellis gave about, you know, how this speaks to our experience as trans people, kind of before we fully figured ourselves out, or like knowing that self-knowledge is an ongoing process, but then, and so that even if we don't have the words, or even if we don't feel like we fully understand everything about ourselves, we're still known and loved, you know, and that just feels really resonant to me. So I'll definitely be taking that with me.
Yeah. Love that. I think for me, I think the complexity, as we've been kind of touching on, like throughout as our conversation, and even in the complexity of, for me, what is a very liberating reading of that God knew me, and that sense of God knowing and God calling me into the world, and as my identity as a trans woman, as God's daughter, that is not always even liberating for everyone, that particular reading. And as I think it was, someone pointed out earlier, I can't quite remember who, I think it might have been JFD in the chat, of that potentially could even minimize the struggle that trans and gender expansive people feel and experience. And I think that it definitely can be like holding these things with tension and recognizing that we can all arrive at different perspectives, and to hold that space for one another. I think that's my takeaway. Well, thank you all. Oh, one more comment. I see Jamie says, I like the liturgical prayer response, Lord, hear our prayer, with needing to spell it out. Yeah. I think that's a really kind of, nice way to kind of end and bring to a close, is like, yeah, this conversation, I think there's a prayer in the conversation of just this engaging with God in that way, and with one another. So thank you all for being here, for the great conversation, for everyone for responding in the chat, or anyone also hasn't responded in the chat or will be watching later. Appreciate you all being here. Our next Bible Study Live will be on September 18th, I believe.
18th, yep.
Yep. And so we will see you back here on the YouTube channel. And otherwise, we'll maybe see you in support groups or around the Discord. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.